Ladies and gentlemen, we would rather see a guilty person walk off freely than innocent civilians dying unnecessarily. We choose life over death, and in this debate we will explain to you why offering dictators immunity in return for leaving power is a moral obligation that saves lives and improves the situation in the country after the takeover. During popular revolts or civil wars, when dictators feel that their end may be near, some choose to flee, like Ben Ali of Tunisia who fled to Saudi Arabia, but others do not, either because they do not have this chance, or because they choose not to, feeling uncertain of their safety in exile. In both these situations, they fight until the bloody end. By formalizing immunity offers, we will incentivize a greater number of dictators to leave the country rather than fight till the end, so saving the lives of citizens. We propose a model in which the UN Security Council would give dictators one-time immunity offers on an individual basis, under conditions of, first of all, a peaceful relinquishment, and second of all, a quick reply. Also, this immunity could be extended to the further leading elite as to minimize backlash. Truth commissions would be set to investigate the dictators' wrongdoings and publish reports on them, as to give the dictators' victims closure on their wrongdoings, and also an interim government would be set, allowing the opposition to acquaint itself with governance and assisting with the creation of new political parties and ultimately elections. In my speech, I'll first talk about the moral reasoning behind offering dictators this immunity and why we believe it's a moral duty. Then I will move on to the practical side of the motion and explain why dictators would even be wanting or willing to accept such offers. And after that, the second speaker of our team will talk about how offering dictators immunity in return for leaving power will lead to a more orderly and long-lasting transition in that country. So first of all, why do we consider offering immunity rather than pursuing justice at all costs the moral imperative? Ladies and gentlemen, dictatorships are characterized as regimes in which a single person or a group of people seize power in a state through force. In order to maintain this power, they use violence and terror through the army, through the police or organizations such as the KGB in Belarus or the ISI in Pakistan. They deprive their citizens of their basic rights, the rights to freedom of speech, freedom of association, owning property, sometimes even life. One would expect that in light of such violation, justice would always be demanded. And yes, naturally, we do agree that justice is a great thing, and prosecuting and punishing everyone for crimes they have committed is a nice idea. But ladies and gentlemen, there are certain situations where it is not the best idea, because in some situations, pursuing justice would only cause more deaths. And without your life, ladies and gentlemen, you will not do anything about justice, because life is a prerequisite for all the other rights we have. So what situations are we talking about? Especially during popular revolts, when dictators feel that they're losing power. For example, in Tunisia after 2 or 3 weeks, or in Libya, when the parts of the army deserted the military dictators, or when their ministers stopped supporting them, or after a few weeks of rallies, the dictator starts to feel he's losing power. So he can either decide to flee the country, or he can try to fight for his life. Because in light of his brutal regime, no thank you, he knows that if he loses this power, ladies and gentlemen, he will not escape prosecution and very probably death. Well, no dictator, no human person would want to face death voluntarily. So what do? They fight with all the force they have, no thank you, putting down the opposition and killing innocent civilians, ladies and gentlemen, who die unnecessarily. In Libya and Syria, numbers have reached several thousands. In Syria, it recently passed 2,000 civilians who died unnecessarily only during the protests, which is what we want to prevent by offering dictators immunity. The opposition, no thank you, will be quick to say that, yes, this is a nice idea, it won't work. We have other alternatives of getting the dictator to leave power, such as sanction or diplomatic pressure. First of all, that is not mutually exclusive with our model, because sanctions can stay in practice. And second of all, they are not as effective as some may think they are. Let's look at reality. A lot of dictatorships have sanctions on them, and it's not doing anything with the dictator's regime. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, if the opposition is as strong as you say, then why can't internal reform happen when that opposition takes over and the rebel government comes into place?
If the opposition is as strong as, okay, the situation we are talking about is when there are revolts, when the country itself is having problems, when from the inside people are protesting, and when that happens, a lot of the time, a civil war comes into place, or fighting, where a lot of the deaths happen. So these are the situations we're talking about. When the opposition starts to rebel in a great extent, but we do not want it to become a fight. So even if it is strong enough, there will be a fight, and many people will die unnecessarily. No thank you. So this leads me to the second point in my speech. Although we do not need to prove that all of the dictators will take this immunity, because that would be bizarre, I will explain to you why at least some of them would be willing to do so. Ladies and gentlemen, the choice of agreeing to abdicate without prosecution gives the dictator in question a chance of a peaceful retirement. This, in comparison to the other options he has, is the most appealing. First of all, if he ever had one, his ideology has long diminished, and second of all, especially if the international community has joined the opposition in requesting that he leave, his chance of resuming power is extremely small. So he can either go to exile, or he can fight with all the force he has in order to prolong his life as much as possible. It is obvious that in comparison with the latter, our model is the most desirable. However, what should also be noted is that in comparison with the first option, our model is better also, because when dictators choose to flee on their own, they have no guarantee of safety in exile. They have no guarantee of not being prosecuted. For example, Charles Taylor of Liberia was granted exile in Nigeria in 2003, but 3 years later was arrested and committed to trial and, ladies and gentlemen, killed. Or, for example, Ngo Dinh Diem of southern Vietnam was promised safe exile in 1963 during popular revolt, and he surrendered under conditions of safety, but later was executed. Ladies and gentlemen, no thank you. Our system would be institutionally embedded into the international law, containing guarantees, thus making more dictators willing of accepting it, leaving power, and preventing the deaths that we are talking about. This reasoning presupposes that dictators are rational beings. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, we believe, first of all, many of them are in general. This can be noted on how they're able to negotiate strategic allies. For example, Sadat of Egypt, who signed peace accords with Israel, which proved extremely useful in the long run. But this is a little slightly different situation because, this is their life they're talking about. And ladies and gentlemen, everyone is self-interested, especially dictators. They want to save their lives, so they, yes, will be willing to do anything to prolong their own lives. Thank you.
That's entirely true, but their rationale is that their country is the most important thing until their life is in danger. When their life is in danger, they will take exile. But at that point, we could have beaten them anyway, so there's no point in offering them immunity.
Ladies and gentlemen, we do not believe that. As I said, if a dictator is able to find exile on his own, it's not about money, it's not about finding a place, it's about being given this guarantee. He doesn't want to go to a place where he won't be sure whether he will be okay. Ladies and gentlemen, so this has worked in the past. For example, Raul Cedras, the military dictator of Haiti, was granted this immunity, and he took it, and instead of a great fight going on in Haiti in 1994, it all turned into a beautiful, peaceful transition into a better regime. Or in 1986, the Filipino dictator Ferdinand Marcos agreed to be exiled by the United States rather than suppress rebellion and cause unnecessary violence and unnecessary deaths. So ladies and gentlemen, again, we are talking about situations that are at the end of a regime, or hopefully at the end, when people have started to protest, when their fighting is going on in the minds of people, when they are ready to get the dictator down. But we do not want that to happen. We do not want the fights to come into place. We want to prevent them. When these people inside are willing to take the dictator down, we want to give them an offering, a hand of help to prevent the deaths from happening. And dictators, yes, we believe, would be willing because it is in their own help. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Team Ireland have 4 points that they want to bring this morning. We want to talk about why incentivising dictators occurs in all the wrong ways on the side of proposition. We want to talk about the need for justice. We're going to talk about why this motion prolongs the road to peace, and then we're going to talk about the harmful international effects of this proposition. And we're going to do this under the team line that dictatorial immunity is equated to criminal impunity. I'm going to deal with our first 2 points, but before I do that, I have 4 areas of rebuttal. Firstly, on the use of the UN Security Council in their model, that's going to simply politicise this whole system, and secondly, it's going to be slow and difficult to get anything through because of the use of veto in that system. Secondly, on the use of truth commissions as a way of bringing closure to people, we think that that doesn't necessarily bring closure to people, because a lot of the time, these people know that this dictator has harmed them. They know it, but they want to see him brought to justice. They want accountability. This kind of talking about it won't be enough in these cases, so we don't think that stands. Thirdly, this thing about saving innocent lives. The entire premise of Team Proposition is that lives are being saved, civilians being saved. But we think that because this is only occurring at the very end of that regime, firstly, lives have been lost throughout the entirety of the regime. So we're talking about a very small gap between when you'd offer immunity and when the regime would have naturally fallen. We think, no thank you, that this isn't the time to offer immunity. And you specifically state stated that this is about people revolting. This is about opposition rising up because of the oppression that they've been suffering. We think that those people should get to fight for their new government. We think that those people want to fight for that new government. And we think that internal reform, no thanks, is the best way to go for this. Because we think that that's the best way for countries to move on. We think that that's the best way for this thing to be dealt with. Fourthly, dictators are rational. Yes, that's true. But it doesn't mean that they're just going to accept immunity, because dictators love to be in power. They crave power. They crave that. And so we think that they're going to fight to the bitter end, yes. But ultimately, if the opposition is there, we think it's important that we give that opposition that chance to take the dictator down and not come in with this immunity and not deny them their justice. So now to my first point. I want to talk about why incentivizing dictators in all the wrong ways occurs under this proposition. We feel that this proposition actually exacerbates the threat that dictators pose throughout the world. And they do this firstly through loss minimization. Because we look at the nature of failure for a dictator, and we say that failure for a dictator is losing his regime to someone else. And the way that this failure is usually brought about is when either his opposition rises up against him because of the oppression that they've been suffering, or the international community recognises this oppression, says that it is wrong, and intervenes. But now, and the consequences for that failure have traditionally been either facing that internal opposition and having to deal with internal reform, which we think is a good thing, or facing prosecution, bringing him to justice. However, under this proposition, a third consequence of failure occurs, the consequence of immunity, clearly more desirable than the other two. So we think that that's what the dictator is going to want. But the problem with this is that now the consequences of failure for a dictator throughout the entirety of his regime have been curbed, and we think that it incentivizes him to take more of those risks that lead to that failure. They incentivize him to carry out more atrocities, to harm more civilians, because ultimately, if the opposition rises, no thank you, he'll be able to go off and live in a house in Switzerland. And we think that that's a really, really dangerous thing to do, because you're removing the safeguard of consequences, a very important tool in the fight against dictatorships. But also, because we're talking about the fact that this is when dictatorships are ending, we think that it actually changes the behaviour of a dictator at this time, because we weren't really given details of who would and wouldn't be offered immunity. And we think two things will happen because of this. Firstly, if at the end of the regime the dictator is offered immunity, you haven't really done very much, because the opposition could have dealt with it, or the international community could have dealt with it, and justice could still have been preserved. But more dangerously, I'll take you in a moment actually, more dangerously, we think that what's going to happen is that dictators who haven't been offered immunity are going to want this immunity. And how do they get it? By creating outcry from the international community, by carrying out attention-seeking atrocities, by harming more civilians, the people that you're supposedly trying to save.
Two things. First of all, when people are revolting, they are revolting against the regime itself. They want freedom, not against the dictator. And second of all, this justice is beautiful, but ladies and gentlemen, hundreds of thousands of people are dying.
Okay, these people aren't revolting against their dictator. I think that they are. I think that they are revolting against the one man whose entire regime is built upon injustice. I think that they are revolting against the one man who allows people, their brothers, mothers, sisters, fathers, to be killed under this oppression. I think it's completely untrue to say that they're not revolting against him. And secondly, yeah, justice is beautiful. I agree. I'm going to talk about that in my second point. And why, considering the fact that you're not actually really saving that many lives, and that you're actually exacerbating the threat the dictators pose throughout their entire regime, it doesn't make sense to sacrifice justice. Okay. Also, we think that you're removing the incentive for internal reform, which is a really dangerous thing to do, because we think that that's the most powerful way for dictatorships to change. And we point to the example of in '88, having lost Soviet sponsorship, Mengistu of Ethiopia renounced Marxism-Leninism and moved to a multi-party system simply because he was afraid of defeat by the rebels in his country. So we think that internal reform is one of the much better options on the table. Now I want to talk about my second point, and I want to talk about the need for justice, because Team Proposition have tried to tell you that justice is just a beautiful idea and that it's really not that important. But we think that justice actually has an incredibly important practical application in these situations. In developed societies, justice is one of the founding principles of the state. But why is this? It's because in recognising the importance of the congruence between what a person suffers and what they deserve to suffer, and the importance of the impartiality with which we judge what it is that they deserve, we think that we recognise the intrinsic importance of every human being and their right to dignity and respect. So clearly a just society is one in which we would like to live. But immunity poses a great threat to modern conceptions of justice and also the practical administration of it within a country. And we think that that's for two reasons. We think that firstly, throughout his regime, a dictator carried out several individual acts of injustice. But more than this, the lack of accountability and the violence which with he ruled kind of created a broader injustice, because we think the whole concept of a dictatorship, the whole concept of autocracy, is based upon the principle of injustice. So when this regime is finally falling, we think that there is immense opportunity for change within this country to move away from this dictatorship. But under that proposition, this change will never be meaningful and it will never happen properly, because they've compromised justice, and that's a dangerous thing because it's compromised on a national scale. And that means two things. It means, firstly, there's a danger that old ways will seep back into the system because you haven't truly broken from the principle of injustice, so it's likely to fall back into that autocratic style of regime. But secondly, without the administration of justice being seen by those who were harmed under the dictatorship, they have no faith in the institutions of that government, nor in the concept of government, the idea of rights and responsibilities, the idea that their government can do more than harm them, than oppress them. Ladies and gentlemen, for Team Ireland, I've talked about why this proposition incentivises dictators in all the wrong ways, why it actually exacerbates the threat the dictators posed. I've talked about the need for justice, and I've done this under the team line: dictatorial immunity equates to criminal impunity. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that justice is a great concept, but we are here to debate some situations where justice needs to step back in order to save lives. And we, ladies and gentlemen, told you that human lives are very important. What team of opposition does in this debate is they let the people die, then count the list and charge the dictators, or not even do that. Ladies and gentlemen, what we believe is that since human life is the prerequisite for all other rights, and justice without human life doesn't mean anything, therefore Team Slovakia stands on the right side. So let me move to the points of rebuttal now. They have told us in their first argument that we are incentivizing these dictators to kill off more people just in order to take the immunity. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what we believe is that dictators do not kill people for fun. They do kill it for a reason once they're revolting against them. They do not have a reason to ask for the immunity if there are no revolts, if there are not jeopardized on their lives. Therefore, we believe that nobody will really kill off people in order to get the immunity.
Sir.
No, thank you. And also we understand that in case these dictators would like the immunity, they could negotiate it in these specific cases, since our model claims it is on the individual pattern. Now, they have also told us that rather than that, they would like the dictators to do, no thank you, to do the change, the reform themselves. But this is a great contradiction with the point of justice they have told about just after that. Because when the dictator himself does the change, he will never suffer the consequences for the dire acts he committed. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, this is a great contradiction, and we would like Team Ireland to explain it. And we believe that in all of this, people are not fighting to die. People want a change in their country. These people want the dictator to go off and then having the ability to participate in the new government. And this is what we are offering them, because the new multi-party system will not be discriminating any ideas, and therefore the opposition that is fighting against the dictator will be able to stand up at a table and in the multi-party system and not be discriminated against. And we believe that this is the change that these people are aiming for, a democracy. And I will talk about this in my point of my substantial point. Now, they have also told us that United Nations are politicized and therefore they are not going to achieve any results. But we have seen recently, in the example of Libya, that countries just do not decide according to a pattern. These countries have the ability to vote, and they are going to use it, and they are going to uphold our model just to save these lives and just to get rid of these dictators. And they have also told us that the closure for these people is not going to be provided. But what we believe is, ladies and gentlemen, that these people want their dictators to vanish in the first place. And ladies and gentlemen, our truth commissions are going to issue some reports. Well, it will be, no thank you, it will be agreed that this dictator committed some crimes, and ladies and gentlemen, they therefore are going to be acknowledged for their wrongdoings. So, ladies and gentlemen, what I have no thank you told you now is that people do not want to die. The human life is the prerequisite for all other lives, and therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that this is even more important than justice that we would like to achieve in all other cases. So, ladies and gentlemen, and now I would like to move on to our substantial point, which is a peaceful transition to democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that the manner in which the dictatorship transits to democracy is very important, and it has great implications on the stability in the future. And we can explain this on two levels. The first and basic level is that after a civil war, after a long conflict, the infrastructure of the country is devastated. We believe that in order for the government to concentrate on the new agenda of developing a new government, ladies and gentlemen, we first need to avoid as much conflict as possible, just that these governments do not have to emphasize on rebuilding the country in the first place. And we have many evidence of the, on the fact that countries are devastated after long wars. This can be seen, for example, on the example of Haiti, where, Ivory Coast, I'm sorry, where just a short conflict caused 14,000 people to be displaced, and the public hygiene in Ivory Coast completely broke down.
Sir.
We believe, that this is one of the examples that conflicts cause the infrastructure collapse.
Sir.
And this could be prevented in our model. Ladies and gentlemen, but the second point is even more important, and we believe that if the dictator is disposed of, he will be, in the first place, viewed as a martyr by his proponents after he is disposed of. These people who really love their dictator are going to fight for him even after he is dead. And they will believe that because because he was not maybe tried justly, as we can see in the cases of many cases in the past. Ladies and gentlemen, a new conflict will arise in the country, a civil war between the proponents and opponents. And we, in order to provide stability, do want to avoid this. Also, ladies and gentlemen, we understand that in many other cases, even if these people will not want to fight in order for their dictator, in the idea of their dictator, they will fight just because they are threatened. They are threatened that the same thing what happened to their dictator is going to happen to them. That they are going to be hanged, and therefore they are going to arm and fight just to avoid the possibility of being executed.
Sir?
Yes, ma'am.
Why wouldn't they do that? If you're only giving immunity to the dictator, those same supporters will still do that anyway.
If I understand you correctly, then you say that these people will just claim another, continue in the dictatorship, but what we are saying is that we are providing the immunity also for the leading elites. But what I'm talking about are the regular people, that were supporting the dictator, and that are going to be threatened that they've supported his ideas at one point of the time, and that they are going to be tried the same way as their dictator, and that they are going to be hanged. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we see that in this point as well, a conflict is very imminent, and that we don't want this to happen in order for the democracy to be established. Rather than that, what our model provides is a peaceful transition to a multi-party democracy, where the ideas of both the proponents and opponents will not be discriminated against. And both sides, and especially the proponents of the former proponents of dictator, will feel cheated and deceived that their dictator left them just like that, and they will want to adapt to this new system where their ideas will be heard in a democratic way. For example, the post-communist countries of Europe are an example of this, where after the dictators left, the regimes peacefully transited into democracy just because this space was provided for both the proponents and opponents in the new multi-party system. And also another example, a great example, is a situation in Malawi, where after Hastings Banda has resigned, the new democratic regime is still contains a great party with his former proponents. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have shown you in this speech is that human lives are not numbers. That every human life is important, and that human life is a prerequisite for all the other lives. We are providing a closure for these victims, and more than that, we are letting these people survive. What they are doing is the contrary. And ladies and gentlemen, because we have shown you this, and we have also shown you that the country will peacefully transit to democracy, we have the moral obligation just to try this. It's another option to get rid of the dictator, and we believe we have the moral duty to use it. Thank you very much. Vote for the proposition.
Madam Speaker, Team Ireland has laid before you our 4 points. That this motion incentivises dictators in all the wrong way, that there is a genuine need for justice, that this motion prolongs the road to peace in nations, and that the harmful international effects. Karen has already described to you points 1 and 2. the incentivizing dictators in all the wrong ways, and the need for justice. I'd like to extend our case to point 3 and 4, that this motion prolongs the road to peace and the harmful international effects. First, some pieces of rebuttal. Possibly the biggest premise that the proposition is based everything upon is their ability to save lives. We say that, quite frankly, this is simply erroneous. To start off, we say that they use language such as, when anger is building up in people's minds and a fight may break out. We see that dictators largely have a lot of confidence in themselves and very large interest in holding on to power. They don't give up when their citizens are angry. We say that essentially, like in situations, we see dictators remaining head of state after they're dead. These aren't the kind of guys who like to just give up power at a whim. No thanks. We think that they will only accept your offer of immunity when it is obvious to them that is their only chance to survive. And this is very important because it talks about the end of conflict. No thanks. You don't avoid a fight. You end the fight slightly sooner than we on opposition. And we say you sacrifice an awful lot for that. You sacrifice lives, not just justice. More than this, we say that it leads to fights far more, because the end of a conflict isn't death. The end of a conflict is immunity. And a house in Spain is a lot nicer than your head on a pike. For this reason, we say that dictators are more incentivized to hold out on a fight, to try to cling on to power, do everything in their power to resist opposition from within their nation, because in the end of the day, if it all goes wrong, they still have their lives. It curbs their consequences, no thank you, and for that reason we say it's more likely to prolong fights. And that's where we see that they don't save lives. They mean that every dictatorship has to end in a bloodbath. And yes, they can save the handful of individuals in this bloodbath. We don't think that legitimizes the many more that they will create. Next, they pointed out quite a bizarre contradiction in our case, saying that dictators prosecuted in internal reform will never face justice. We don't agree with this. We see that when we talk about dictators prosecuted in internal reform, it's from internal opposition, not themselves stepping down. We say that often this does happen in places like Egypt recently, that internal pressure, no thanks, can win the battle, and in these cases we think it's actually a lot better than the international violence. We say that when you can put pressure on a dictator, when he knows that his life is on the line, he gives up a lot sooner than if his life isn't on the line. And that's why we say it takes less violence in internal reforms, and smaller battles can get rid of a dictator where you demand bloodshed. Also, they spoke a little bit about the UN, and we say that they misunderstood the reason that we say that the UN is ineffective. We don't think that there are, we think that actually there's a lot of, the veto system in the UN makes it very difficult to pass things even if they're morally correct, because countries have interests in the other nations, in control rights and all these things, and we say actually down the line it's been really, really difficult to enforce to get things passed in the UN, which makes it much slower for international help to come. No thanks. So now I want to move on to my first point of substantive, that this motion prolongs the road to peace. Essentially, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, this the death of a dictator, the prosecution of someone who has taken nearly everything from citizens, who has harmed them, attacked them, murdered, brings closure. We say that the fundamental difference between our side of the house and theirs is that we bring closure to an event, justice for it, and allow individuals to move on, whereas they expect them to forget a pain that has never been dealt with. The closure has never come. The people who have killed have never been put to justice. There has never even been an admission that wrong was done. They talked about truth and reconciliation. Actually, yeah, go for it.
Well, sir, we have the truth commissions which will issue reports and which will acknowledge that these wrongdoings happen. This is not true.
Exactly, sir. And that's what I'm saying. You have truth and reconciliation ceremonies that will say that this man stole nearly everything from society and is allowed to live in Spain in a house. This is no kind of justice. This isn't a genuine acknowledgement that wrong has been done. We say they only give words to people who have had their families murdered, and that's not good enough from state. We say that action has to actually follow these words to bring closure, that there has to be a genuine sense that the wrong has been done, and because wrong has been done, there is justice given. Without this, we don't think the harms have been committed are actually over. We say that they are ongoing traumas that they just expect these people to forget, and they need to bring it on. And we say that's a massive closure the prosecuting dictator gives. No, thank you. Also, we say that it brings trust in the state. Why? Because when you lost everything, your state has stood by you. Justice has vindicated your rights. The least important individuals in society have, for their rights, they've taken down someone who tried to make themselves God. The biggest criminal in an entire nation, the dictator who harmed so many individuals, was put to justice for even the least in society. And this is what Karen talked about for the importance of justice. Because justice is only a benefit if it is universal. It is fundamentally an oppressive force that makes you abide by rules, that provides punishments. But if it is a universally applied force, then we say it gives massive protection to these people, because they know that others in society are held accountable for their actions upon them, that other people are disincentivized to harm them, and other people will be punished if they harm them. This offering of protection actually drags people into the state, because the state isn't just a formality, it's a reality that can protect these people, ensure that their lives are peaceful, and give them something to move on with. We think that's really important from a state that comes from ruins, warfare, that people are able to trust it to protect them and to move on. More than this, we say there's a public decry of tyranny. We say it's really important for these nations at their development to say that tyranny is fundamentally wrong and that they have to move on. When you do this in these nations, we say that it shows that the new government opposes tyranny, not just what the dictator does. And we say that when this happens, their points fall about people feeling worried about their own persecution, because it shows that this state will not tolerate persecution of any kind, not just the dictator's ideals. So now on to point 4, the harmful international effects of this proposition. We say that essentially what this proposition does is it highlights and massively strengthens perceptions that the West cares very little for the harms of the developing world. Why is this? Because democracy is an alien ideal that won't protect them, they can't trust. It's a change from dictatorship, but is this honestly going to be smelling of roses? It's not a beautiful country, they're coming out of warfare, and these people aren't even protected from it. We say that without this safety, equality, protection that democracy could have brought had they persecuted dictator, it's nothing but an empty shell of an alien ideal that we sacrificed their rights for. We stole their justice to provide our ideal, and that's essentially going to make the international community seem much further apart. Also, it's hypocritical in a society where we will give our own citizens free legal aid to make sure that their rights are always vindicated. We're willing to just throw away theirs as if that's just a choice we can deal with. We say that essentially, Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker, this turns the West away from the West international community. In that nation, it makes it much easier for it to slip back into dictatorship, into autocracies, because the new way of democracy isn't trusted. And also in other nations, it makes it far more difficult for us to act as legitimate actors to bring them out of dictatorships. For all these reasons, for incentivizing dictators in the wrong ways, for the need for justice, for the fact that this motion prolongs the road to peace and costs lives, and for the harmful international effects, we say that dictatorial immunity equates to criminal impunity and must fall.
Ladies and gentlemen, in my speech, I will touch on the 3 points of contention in this debate. The first point was about saving the lives of people who live in dictatorships and who are trying to break away and who are trying to make a revolution. Second of all, I'll talk about justice, and I'll talk about why justice in this situation can be forgone for the lives that will be saved. And then I will talk about the issues of transition and how actually transition in the atmosphere of reconciliation rather than revenge is the kind of transition we want, and is the transition that leads to longer lasting results. So, to move on to the first point I would like to talk about. In our first speech, we have clearly told you that we are going to save lives of people who are protesting against the government, and the government is trying to suppress the protest. You know, what team of opposition have told us is that actually at some point we no longer need to offer them, these dictators, immunity, because we could have as well beaten them anyway. Well, first of all, that is not true. There is some middle ground where we are not sure if we are going to be able to beat, no thank you, the dictators and to oust them from the state. And this means that in this middle ground, the whole play is sort of in the middle. And this means that the dictator at the same time feels unsafe and threatened because the people are rallying and he's trying his best to suppress them, while at the same time he seems to be failing and prolonging the conflict. Go on.
If this middle ground is so important, then why hasn't Colonel Gaddafi taken this offer of immunity that's already on the table? Because he's so powerful, and he likes power, and he wants to stay in power. He's not going to take immunity in this middle ground.
Well, that is to be... Colonel Gaddafi has not taken the immunity because of the fact that probably this middle ground hasn't been reached yet. He seems to think that he is powerful enough to suppress, no thank you, the revolution. However, what is important to note is that this offer of course will not work all the time. However, it is a good thing to have this offer of immunity on the table in order to be able to at least try to save the lives of people who could have died unnecessarily. No thank you. So now I would like to move on to the point about justice. Team of opposition have told us that justice is really important in the society, and we generally agree with this. It would be absurd to think that justice is a vague concept that is generally not good. No thank you. However, we believe that in situations where human lives are at the stake, we can forgo justice, because justice only takes place after the wrongdoings have been done. It only takes place post hoc. It can't, you know, bring the people back from the graves. It cannot undo what has been done. No, thank you. So, to the point of closure, justice only brings the form of closure in acknowledgement of the wrongdoings as well. Because the people who have lost their children, who have lost their kinsmen in the war or in the protest, are not going to get them back. However, what we can do is try to minimize the number of people who are affected by this situation. And that is exactly what we are aiming for. This is why we can forego justice, because we are offering an alternative which also brings at least some kind of closure for the victims, and this is what, no thank you, we are standing for. We are standing for the next best alternative. Furthermore, to the point of justice, I would like to tell you that justice in transition oftentimes is not justice at all. It's just bloody revenge. We believe...
Sir!
No, thank you. We believe that this justice isn't the nice kind of justice they have been talking about this, you know, taking them accountable for their crimes and about this whole nice idea. It's plain retribution. These people... No, thank you. These people are often tried in summary trials, summarily executed, without due process. This is not justice at all. At least it is not the nice kind of justice that Team Ireland have been talking about throughout the debate. Yes?
In fact, we're talking about proper prosecutions, we're talking about proper trials. We never, vindicated show trials. We're saying that we want people to be tried properly, to see what they've done and to be judged on that.
The problem is, it only rarely happens in reality. We have seen that in, for example, the example of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, who was tried just for the show. We have seen that, for example, in the trial of Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania, who was tried, just for the show and executed literally minutes after the verdict. So, I believe this is likely to happen. Now I would like to move on to the third point, no thank you, which is the point of transition to the new society. What we have told you is that we essentially want everyone to calm down, step back a little, and try to rebuild the society on new principles, no thank you, which can be achieved through our model because it sets up the interim transitional government where all the different people, all the different ideologies are represented. Also, the ideologies that were perpetuated by the dictator in the past are represented, and not only it allows for some continuation in the governance, because let's face it, the country also needs to function properly for at least some time. It also allows for people to not be afraid of, being prosecuted as well, because what Jan has been telling you was that people who have supported the dictator in the past are going to feel afraid because of the prosecution that they could face themselves. But if we want to achieve some peaceful transition, we need to acknowledge that they also have something to say, rather than embarking on the journey of retribution, which then leads to more conflict, as these people who feel unsafe about their well-being, who feel cheated and who then feel cheated and abandoned by the new government, which excludes them, which has made its revenge on the dictator, which has made him a martyr for them. These people are then going to be fighting not only for the ideology, but for the revenge of their dictator as well. What we want to achieve is by the atmosphere of reconciliation, which is provided by the transitional government, which includes all factions from the country and truth commissions, which provides some closure and reconciliation. What we want to achieve is peaceful transition to democracy and saving lives. Thank you.
Madam Speaker, Team Ireland have come before you today with 4 main points in opposition to this motion. We firstly talked about, 1, why incentivising dictators in all the wrong ways is what this proposition is really doing. We secondly talked about the need for justice in these societies. We thirdly talked about why this motion will prolong the road to peace. And finally, we talked about the harmful international effects that this motion would bring. In summing up the case for Team Ireland, I want to divide this case in 2. We are firstly going to look at the short-term harms of this proposition. We are going to look at how we save as many people as possible. We will secondly look then at how we save people going forward and how we advance a society that can function in the future for a stable and prosperous future. So to get straight into it, the first point about the short-term effects. If we look at the time frame issue that has become apparent in this debate, Team Proposition have told us that this will be offered near the end of regimes. What Team Ireland have said to them is that this can only happen, the only reason that dictators will accept this is when they are on their knees, when they will have been beaten anyway. Because if we examine what a dictator is thinking at this point, no thank you. If we examine what they are thinking at this point, they are thinking that their country comes before everything else except life. So it is only when their life is in danger that they will give up their country and go off to their villa in Spain. Like Gaddafi is holding out in his bunker in Libya, he obviously doesn't feel that his life is in danger. No thank you. Because otherwise he would have taken that immunity that has been offered to him months ago. So we say that this immunity, we don't have any control over when we offer this immunity. Because once that immunity is on the table, if a dictator feels that everything is going south, he can just cling on to power and start committing atrocities such as rape and mass murder, which have no strategic benefit to his campaign, but he does them to get attention, because the international community will then wake up and see, look at the terrible things that are happening in this country. We have to do something. I know, let's offer him immunity. No thank you. That's just simply not going to work, because the dictator now has all the power. And if we look at the choices that we give dictators, we said that it is dangerous to open up their options too much, because at the moment their options are to be prosecuted or to look towards internal reform. They can do things like set up a new parliament, a small bit of devolution of power, and things like that. But we say, once you give this cosy option of immunity, all of those incentives to turn towards things like internal reform, like we've seen with Pinochet in Chile, and like we've seen in Ethiopia, are gone. Yes, please.
But how is justice achieved in this scenario you are talking about?
Because the man who is ultimately responsible for your mother getting raped and your father getting murdered is being held to account. He's in a court and he's in handcuffs being sentenced for the things that he's done. That is justice, ladies and gentlemen. That man swimming in a swimming pool in a villa in Spain, that is not justice. That is him getting off scot-free while you suffer in your country in destitute. That is not what we want to stand for on Team Ireland, and we don't think that this motion should pass for that reason. Also, we say that when you reduce options like that, we say that it is too easy for a dictator to fall back on things like immunity. We say that it turns them away from important things like reform, like we said. And we've already seen this with Gaddafi, because we've given him several chances in the past, in the 80s and the 90s. He's upset the West before, and they've given him second chances. What has he done with those second chances? Rubbed it in our faces. So what are we going to do this time? Let him away with it again? We don't think so. We said that this man should be held account for the things he has done, and we think that's why this motion should not be passed. Thank you. So the second point that we want to look at is the issue of long term. the long-term issue. How do we set up this country for the future so that it will be sustainable and steady growth for the future? How do we set it up so that they can move on from the horrors of their past? How do we set it up so that we can actually advance this society? If we look at the first issue of closure, there has been quite a lot of chat about this in this debate. We say on Team Ireland that people need to move on. This has been agreed with by the proposition, but the way that they get to this moving on is by letting the man who is ultimately responsible away with that crime. That is not justice, ladies and gentlemen. That is not allowing people to move on. Just because you're basically saying that these things that have happened are insignificant and that we shouldn't worry about them because they're not happening in our backyard. Sure, of course it doesn't matter. We'll just let it happen there and let these people suffer while their fathers, mothers have to be buried in body bags. We said that that is not acceptable and we won't stand for it. No, thank you. We also want to deal with this issue of justice saving lives. We say that yes, the whole purpose of justice is to uphold rights and save lives. And we say that that is what will happen in the future. We've already shown you that the benefits they've given you of the short term, where they'll save lives, just aren't relevant because they just won't happen. Because we said the dictator has control of these situations and so will actually cause more people to die. But also, if we look at the long term, if we look at these people's psyche, if something is not done about those crimes, what are they going to do? Are they just going to accept it, lie down and say, oh, well, it's obviously the wish of the new state. We should clearly accept this. No, of course not. If we look at Rwanda, the most horrific example of genocide in recent history, we say that that happened because of oppression over many years, because of how the previous regime was disposed of. We say there was no natural justice there whatsoever, and that ultimately culminated in one of the worst genocides in recent history. We don't want that to happen again, and that's why we are opposing this motion, because we say that once you have the lack of justice in this new society, you're not separating the new from the old in any way. And that's very important to understand, because we say that what this motion will do is it will make sure that things are the exact same as they were before. What this society needs is to move on, is to advance. How do they do that? By seeing the man who is responsible for the horrible things that him and his men have done in handcuffs, in his prison cell somewhere in The Hague, or even in their own country. We say that these things allow people to see that justice is actually happening. How do you explain to someone who has had their entire family butchered that the man who is responsible for this is actually having a better time than he was before? How are people supposed to understand that and even accept that? Yes?
What we are saying is that we do not want this family to be butchered in the first place.
That's fine. Team Ireland don't want his family to be butchered either. We'd much prefer if his family wasn't butchered. But your motion, your proposition, doesn't mean that his family won't be butchered. Because as we've already explained, the dictator, if things are going south and the offer of immunity is out there somewhere, he's going to do whatever he can to get that. He is going to grab onto that with whatever he can. He is going to start committing mass rape, start committing mass murder, things to get our attention so that we say something needs to be done about this. Let's offer him immunity. No, thank you. We're going to do what we always do. We're going to try and uphold justice, both for short-term benefits and for long-term. If we also look at the message that we send when we prosecute someone, we say that this shows that we are taking a strong stance, that we sympathise with these people for the horrible things that have happened in their country, and that we will do whatever we can to make sure that it won't happen again. We say that this sends a message that we are against all tyranny, because the proposition of painting us as saying that we are just after this one dictator because we don't really like him. That's not true. I'm sure Gaddafi, if he wasn't crazy and had a country, would actually be a nice person. But the fact is, he's done really horrible things. We have to send a message that we're going to do something about that. We can't just let him off scot-free. That is not justice. And then finally, we have the issue of international effects. We say that these people will feel let down by the West and the international community, the people who are supposed to be helping them. And the best example we can give you of this is in Zimbabwe, where Robert Mugabe painted every attempt to help those people as an attack on the citizens of his own country. And as a result, there was massive anti-British sentiment in Zimbabwe for years. That has set us back decades in the race against Mugabe and how we remove him from that regime. And so for all of those reasons, for the reason that that this proposition will incentivise dictators in all the wrong way, that it removes the need for justice, and that this motion prolongs the road to peace and the harmful international effects, and that dictatorial immunity equates to criminal impunity, Team Ireland opposed. Thank you.
In ranking the report from Team Ireland today, I'm going to firstly look at what Team Proposition said in this debate and what Team Ireland's response to that was, and then I'm going to look at Team Ireland's arguments and how they stood by the end of the debate. So firstly, what Team Proposition said. Well, their model involved the UN Security Council, and Team Ireland had a problem with this because we said it politicises the whole process, and also it's going to be slow and difficult because of the veto process. They also talked a lot about truth commissions, and we had an issue with this because we think that the closure that they described from truth commissions isn't necessarily true, and we think that sometimes people need justice, they need accountability in order to feel that they can move on from the atrocities that have occurred. And then in their substantive, they firstly talked about the moral reasoning behind their point. And this was kind of a main theme of the debate, because they were talking about why they're saving more lives than we are, that ultimately we're putting justice on a pedestal and allowing people to die for it. But we had various responses to this, because we said firstly, you're only talking about the very end of a dictatorship, so the time frame in which you're acting is very small. Secondly, we said that you were talking about a time when revolt and opposition was strong, and therefore there was a great capacity for reform to take place, and we thought that that was a better method of solving these problems, because in the long term it's more likely to be sustainable, more likely to work. But we also pointed out how that it in fact exacerbates the threat that dictators pose throughout their regime, because you've curbed the consequences of their failure. They're more likely to take risks, they're more likely to carry out atrocities, because they no longer have to fear that opposition that could rise up, because ultimately they can get away, they can escape. Secondly, practically, they talked about why the dictator will be willing to accept immunity. And to this we said, well yes, the dictator probably will be willing to accept immunity in the few cases where his regime is failing, opposition is rising, but we think that that's not really a time when we want him to accept immunity. Firstly, because it undermines justice, but secondly, again, because of the capacity for internal reform. And then finally they talked about a peaceful transition to democracy and how they're achieving that through their proposition. But to this we kind of said, we definitely said, that justice is a founding principle of democracy, and we think that a state built on a concept of injustice, a state without a proper break from the injustice that that dictatorship had, isn't one that is going to be sustainable in the future. We thought it was a very dangerous way of creating a new government within a society. But what did we bring to the debate? Well, Team Ireland firstly talked about why this proposition incentivises dictators to act in all the wrong ways. We talked about how throughout the regime the dictator is more likely to take risks, how at the end of the regime, if immunity is not on the table, he's more likely to worsen his behaviour, carry out more atrocities, harm more innocent civilians in order to gain that international outcry that will lead to immunity being on the table. So we thought that that was actually, in fact, making things worse, harming more civilians. Secondly, we talked about the need for justice, and we said that justice is important because of the strong link between it and human dignity. We said that immunity is a threat not only to the conception of justice, but its administration within this new government. Because ultimately, if people don't see justice being done, then they don't have faith in the institutions of that new government. They don't have a trust in what that government means and the rights and responsibilities that it's involved. And we thought that that was incredibly dangerous for these people, and again, led into the long-term harms of this proposition. Then we talked about why this motion prolongs the road to peace, why justice is important for law and order in society, and how it's important to avoid the resentment of people who feel cheated by this new regime because justice has not been granted to them for the losses that they suffered, for the lives that were lost. And finally, we talked about the harmful international effects of this motion, why people within dictatorships will see this international immunity offer as the international community undermining the justice that they so greatly deserve. And we also said that it's incredibly hypocritical of the international community to do such a thing, to undermine these people's justice while we ourselves place it on such a high pedestal. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, in my speech I will discuss the three main points in this debate: saving lives, providing justice, and peaceful transition. Lives. Ladies and gentlemen, throughout the whole debate, Team Ireland has been contradicting themselves. On one point they have said the dictators are too strong to accept the immunity. At another point they have said that they will be incentivized to do everything to gain this immunity. We believe that this is a very significant contradiction. But more than that, they have oversimplified the whole case by saying that the immunity is either going to be provided too soon or too late, where there will be no reason to provide it. That is just very close to the end of the war. But what we believe is, ladies and gentlemen, that there is some middle ground. There is some middle ground where the dictator will be still strong enough to fight for his life and wanting to kill as much opposition as possible in order to stabilize his regime. But at the same time, he will feel threatened enough because parts of his army will be splitting apart, parts of his government will be going apart. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not a black or white situation. There will be cases where many lives could be saved, because those are the last weeks, last months of conflict, where dictators are the most brutal and they're behaving in the most bloody way. We want to preserve these lives, and we believe, we have shown you throughout the whole case, these lives are not just numbers. These lives are people who want peace, who want the dictator to vanish, but would rather live and survive than die for the case, ladies and gentlemen. They have told us that dictators kill people just for the sake of killing them, but we believe that this is absurd. We believe that it is the time where the opposition arises, where the conflict begins. And if a dictator feels secure in his regime, there is no reason to want immunity. There is no reason to want to commit these atrocities, because he is safe in his regime. He is not going to kill people just in order to gain immunity. So we believe that on the point of lives, we have proven you that these lives are worth the cost of foregone justice. And that is my second point. Team of Ireland has been talking about justice so much, about the closure for these people, what they demand. But what we believe is that if you ask these people in the streets rioting what they want, is not necessarily their dictator only to be hanged. They want him to be vanished. They want them to take part on the new government, in the new democratic regime. This is what these people want. They don't want their relatives to die. Ladies and gentlemen, justice that you achieve is post hoc. It doesn't take the dead out of the graves. And this is one of the reasons why Team Slovakia should win today. Ladies and gentlemen, also they have portrayed the justice to be that very nice kind of justice, but what we have seen in the cases of Ceausescu and in the case of Saddam Hussein is that these trials are not always that simple, and these trials are often biased, because of the bias that is prevailing in all parts of the society. And ladies and gentlemen, because of this we believe that justice, even in their case, is not going to be the nice kind of justice, and it is going to provide or take with it the great drawback of these lives that will be wasted. And then the last point of my speech is the peaceful transition. And we believe that in order for the society to move forward, yes, some closure needs to be provided, but we do provide this closure by our reports and the commissions, truth commissions that will acknowledge these wrongdoings. But at the same time, we are not fueling any more conflicts in the society. And we have elaborated on this throughout our whole debate that killing the dictator makes him a martyr and makes the people who support him, his supporters, feel threatened. And these people, just in order to avoid the same fate that happened to their dictators, because they do not want to be hanged, and because they do consider him to be a martyr, they will fight, and the conflict will be prevailing. Ladies and gentlemen, we are saving lives, we are providing for a better situation in the short term and the long term. Team Slovakia should win this debate. Thank you.